We're doing a discussion on exploring dominion theology. Thank you for everyone who dropped in to this Zoom call. Thank you to Tim Morley for calling me probably, I don't know when it was, 2 or 3 weeks ago, maybe a month ago, completely out of the blue. I'm going to be honest, when I saw his name come up on my phone, I thought, uh-oh, here we go. He's going to be calling me to say, how come you're not in church anymore? But fortunately, that wasn't the case. He called me to say, I've been listening to some of your podcasts. I think I'm concerned about dominion theology spreading over here in the UK. I remembered some of the names that I've mentioned on the show, on some of the shows. He's like, I've heard of these people. I know some of these people. Therefore, there might be something to worry about. So he said, can we put a call together, which then became sort of just an open invitation for anybody who was interested in the subject. And so if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and start this PowerPoint. Let's see how, no, that's it. Let's see, make sure you can see it. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Now we can. Yep.
Oh, good. Okay, that's good. So this is what I have put together, Exploring Dominion Theology. My name is Dr. Clint Haycock. I host the Mindshift podcast. If you don't follow me on Twitter, you can at Mindshift 2018. All right, so these are the learning outcomes I thought we could put together for this lesson. First of all, let's define dominion theology. So going back to Josh's question, what is it? And crucially, I think we need to explore its relationship to Christian nationalism. That is a critical piece of the whole dominionist puzzle. And we'll look at what Christian nationalism is. And then we're going to talk about what I've identified as 3 streams or iterations of dominion theology. And we want to look at the major figures involved in their origins. They're not exactly the same thing. You can't just say that person is a dominionist. You can say that, but you have to know what you're talking about. Okay. So first of all, we're going to look at Abraham Vereide. That is the guy from Jeff Charlotte's series or the book on the family, and also C Street. He's the founder of ICL, which was International Christian Leadership, which then became the Fellowship Foundation, and now it's more commonly referred to as the family. So we'll look at Vereide and what he taught and what he believed in and where the family is up to now. And then the second stream is R.J. Rushdoony, Christian Reconstructionism. And that's, again, a different stream or iteration of dominion theology, but there's a lot of overlaps. And then Bill Bright, Loren, Cunningham, and C. Peter Wagner. And they're commonly associated with what's called the Seven Mountains Mandate, Dominion Theology, and the NAR, which is the New Apostolic Reformation Churches. So we'll look at that. And again, there's overlaps with all 3 of these, but they're not all exactly the same. All right, it's very crucial to distinguish between these various iterations of dominion theology. I would say, too, if you have any questions, just shout out, interrupt me, and say. But I would suggest maybe mute your mics unless you have a question, only because sometimes if there's background noise, it'll come across. So if you need to ask a question, just unmute your mic and just shout at me, say, wait, can you explain that? Or let's talk about that. But at the end, we can obviously open it up for questions. Where we end, we're going to talk about the final outcome is to talk about how dominionism is spreading worldwide. So going back to Joshua's point, who cares? Why should we care? I think you'll be perhaps even alarmed at the spread of dominionism worldwide. It's kind of a frightening thing. It really is. Not just an American sort of phenomenon. It's absolutely spreading worldwide, and we're seeing it all over the world, literally. Okay, so some of the key quotes that I came across in my research of dominion theology, this kind of gives you a feel for the sort of where they're coming from. Jeff Charlotte calls it weaponized Christianity. That's kind of a scary statement, isn't it? In his book, C Street, weaponized Christianity. And that's kind of the idea of what he's talking about. Another quote, and don't worry, I'm recording this so you can, and I can send you the PowerPoint slideshow if you want it. This I found interesting. In 1955, I was reading the Congressional Senate records of the National Prayer Breakfast in 1955, and the ICL president then at the time, Lieutenant General Willard Paul, spoke, and Vice President Nixon was there, Billy Graham spoke, and the congressional records are available on Google Books. You can find this, but he was talking about the purpose of ICL, which was later to become the family. And General Paul said, a partnership was formed with God to make a better world. I mean, that kind of says a lot, doesn't it? That ICL, which became the family, they are partnering with God, and it's all about somehow making a better world. Now, how that actually looks and what that means is, that's what the family is all about. Another quote, this is from Conway and Siegelman's book, Holy Terror. And there was a woman called Diane. They call her the first ex-evangelical. Diane said of the Christian fundamentalist Christian right movement in 1982, they never actually came out, the fundamentalist preachers, guys like Jerry Falwell and others, they never actually came out and said that democracy was wrong, American democracy. But they said that a pluralistic society was not acceptable to God. They said that freedom of religion was only an illusion and that democracy could only work if Christians had the leadership positions. So I hope you're kind of getting a feel for where these sort of Christian right, Christian dominionists are coming from. They never actually said it was wrong, but you see what they want to install in the in sort of the other realm of things, Christians in the leadership positions. All right, another quote, I think again from Jeff Charlotte. Somebody told Jeff Charlotte, one of these members of the family said, listen, Jeff, remember, it's a kingdom, not a democracy. I mean, to me, that's a chilling quote, isn't it? It's a kingdom, not a democracy. So again, kind of going along with the quote from Holy Terror, they never said democracy was bad, but they're up to something else. They're establishing a kingdom. Another quote, this time from Craig Unger in his book, American Compromise. Now, he talks about in that book, it's all about how Russia was using Trump as a sort of a useful idiot. But he has a really interesting chapter right in the middle of the book on Opus Dei, which is a Catholic dominionist movement. We won't talk about that, but that's another strain of very concerning dominion theology in the Catholic Church. And he calls it authoritarian theology, which I thought was a really interesting way to label, Opus Dei and other sort of theocratic Christian movements. So getting the book American Compromise is worth it just for the chapter on Opus Dei alone, because he talks about how many members of Opus Dei are in high positions of American government. And it's scary. So many. William Barr, for example, he is a member of Opus Dei, and he was obviously the Attorney General under Trump, and he has an agenda, so you got to find these people. And then finally, Fred Clarkson told me on a recent Mindship podcast, without dominionism, there is no Christian nationalism, meaning there obviously is such a thing as Christian nationalism, but it's dominionism that gives Christian nationalism sort of its drive, right? And I'll explain what Christian nationalism is in a minute. So hopefully you're getting kind of a sense of, these are just a few quotes that I've compiled, and there's a lot more that are pretty scary. All right, so moving on then. And this is another quote. I can't see it on my screen, but introducing powerful leaders to Jesus or something.
Amen.
And that's another quote from The Family by Jeff Charlotte, or an article in Harper's by Jeff Charlotte, which came out before his book on the family. And again, you can see that that's the impetus of the family. It's all about building relationships with powerful men, dictators, despots, politicians, wealthy businessmen, to, form relationships and sort of get things done. All right. So let's define it. All right. What is dominion theology? This is maybe going back to, again, Josh's question. What is dominion theology? Where does it come from? Well, it has biblical warrants. The key verse that they cite is Genesis 1:26. Of course, I've had the King James here. God's talking to Adam and Eve in the garden and says, God blessed them and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth and subdue it and have dominion. That's where they get the word from. Over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Now, I'm sure we've got a lot of theologians in here. How is this verse typically interpreted in Christian, sort of typical Christian theology? How have they, and even Jewish theology, how have they interpreted this verse to mean what?
For me, as an evangelical pastor, probably on the left end of evangelicalism a little bit,
Yeah.
this was a call to Christian ecology.
Right. Yeah.
To be
Exactly.
to be stewards of the
Stewardship.
earth. Yeah.
Yeah. And that is exactly right, Tim. That is obviously the classical Christian traditional interpretation of Genesis 1:26. Now, there was a major shift though in the 1980s. Now, this movement predates the 1980s, but it's really in the 1980s you start to see certain American Christian theologians, certain political activists on the Christian right began pushing a different interpretation of this verse that meant Christians were mandated by God to occupy political power in the United States and the world, thus taking dominion. So there's a change because before it used to be about stewardship, as you say, Tim, environmental responsibility, taking care of the earth.
Yeah, Clint, another side note in terms of the time frame here, in the 1980s and 1990s, a far right-wing fundamentalist takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention was in progress.
Yes.
Southern Baptists are in many ways very conservative, but prior to this takeover, you had 6 seminaries, and one of the seminaries was actually pretty liberal.
Mm-hmm.
You had a lot of guys who were more moderate in their interpretation of the scripture.
Yeah.
So what happened every year at the Southern Baptist Convention, and Southern Baptists are basically a democracy, they started working to have a very conservative, usually it was a mega church pastor, elected as president. And gradually, they started repopulating the boards of the seminaries and the denominational agencies.
Mm-hmm.
One interesting note about this, there were 2 men who were key leaders in this, and one was a judge named Paul Pressler from Houston. And I think the first time I ever heard the phrase dominion theology was that people I knew said they had heard that this was what Paul Pressler believed.
Mm.
I think he passed away recently, but one of the things that followed him and has been in the news even in the last year is that a man he had worked with accused him of some inappropriate sexual behavior with him. So it was an accusation of homosexual behavior. So I think that picture sort of in United States' largest Protestant denomination,
Yeah.
that's what was happening. A movement, and they eventually did it. They took over
Yeah,
everything.
they did.
They changed all the seminaries. Everything changed. A lot of churches left the convention. But one of the key leaders of it was this man who's identified with dominion theology and also has accusations of inappropriate homosexual behavior being legally thrown at him.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. And of course, if you know your history, this is right in the period when the Christian right in America really became prominent. 1979, you had the founding of the Moral Majority, Jerry Falwell Sr., and that in the early 1980s, a whole bunch of the organizations that are still around today, like Focus on the Family Research Council, the Council on National Policy, CPAC, which was NICPAC. I mean, there's so many of them that are still around today. They start really gaining a foothold in the early 1980s. And this is when this dominion theology, this interpretation, I should say, and their basic interpretation of the verse was Adam and Eve were granted dominion by God in the garden, but when they sinned, they lost their dominion. And Satan became the god of this world. And that's what the Bible says. Paul talked about that, I think, somewhere in the New Testament, that Satan is the god of this world. And now it's up to Christians to regain the dominion that was lost in the garden. So it's not just about having dominion, it's regaining it, that which was lost by Adam and Eve. And that was one of the major effects of their sin. It wasn't so much about original sin, it was more about losing dominion that was mandated here in this verse, and we got to get it back. And that means we've got to take charge politically. And that's a big sea change in terms of the interpretation. All right, moving on. So I was talking about Christian nationalism. This notion of dominionism is closely allied with the belief in Christian nationalism, the idea that not only was America founded as a Christian nation by the founding fathers, it has, strayed from the path of righteousness and should become a Christian nation again. And so once you buy that basic premise, America was a Christian nation, it's lost its way, it needs to get back to becoming a Christian, then the question becomes, well, how? How does that happen? Well, take dominion. That's the answer. That's how we're going to get this done. We are going to take dominion. We're going to put America back on track. So I think Christian nationalism, that's why I had that quote from Fred Clarkson, without dominionism, there is no Christian nationalism, because without the dominionist piece, the Christian nationalism is just a belief. It's actually putting the pieces together and saying, okay, now we need to do something about the fact that America is no longer a Christian nation, but should become one again. All right, so look at some of these quotes. Here's a quote from, I think it's Chip Burlett, who's another writer along with Fred Clarkson about dominion theology. He says, dominionism is a tendency among Protestant Christian evangelicals and fundamentalists that encourages them to not only be active political participants in civic society, but also seek to dominate the political process as part of a mandate from God. And then he goes on, the vast majority of Christians read this text, Genesis 1:26, what we just read, and conclude that God has appointed them stewards and caretakers of the earth, exactly as Tim was pointing out. As Sarah Diamond, who's another person who wrote a lot on dominion theology back in 1989 or so, she says, however, that some Christians read the text and believe that Christians alone are biblically mandated to occupy all secular institutions until Christ returns. That, in a nutshell, is the idea of dominionism. All right, is it starting to kind of make sense of what they're talking about? That's why the Christian nationalist piece is so important. They've made a major change in terms of the interpretation of Genesis 1:26. So Chip Burlett is another one. There's a really good article in this one on what is dominionism in the Huffington Post. I could send you the link if you want to look at that. But now we need to talk about
Hey,
Christian.
I have a question.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So do you think that maybe a different interpretation of that verse had to do with like a swing in like theology? Or, I mean, of course there is a swing in theology if we have this conclusion, but the NIV doesn't, I don't know what word they use instead of dominion, but they don't, it's not interpreted in the same way as the King James. And I wonder if that's like why some of these groups really hang on to the King James version as well.
It could be, yeah, because as we're going to see, it was R.J. Rushdoony that really put the whole thing together. He was the first person to articulate what is now called dominion theology, and he was a total fundamentalist. He was a King James only guy, right? Yeah, he was a diehard Calvinist. He was a fundamentalist, and a King James only guy. So yeah, he would have stuck with the King James and gotten that word dominion from the King James, I'm sure.
Yeah. I have a question also, Clint. I'm sorry, Shannon.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
So that verse is in Genesis 1.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, many Christians tell the creation story based on Genesis 2.
Yeah.
Which does not have the dominion thing in it. Yeah. So what would be their apologetics response to that? Like, we claim the dominion thing, but we also conflate it with the Genesis 2 story.
Well, it's Genesis 2 is a different perspective, isn't it? The Genesis 1 account is like the 6 days of creation. It's pretty straightforward. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then at the end, there's this dominion mandate as they would see it. But Genesis 2 is about the creation of humanity, isn't it? And the population of the garden. And it's a more personal thing. You get almost a different view of God, walking in the garden in the cool of the day and hanging out with Adam and Eve and creating humanity. I think they would see it as a more personal interpretation. I'm not sure. I don't know how the Dominionists would interpret Genesis 2. I haven't read that far. I only got as far as Genesis 1.
Yeah, well, they're basically the same story told two different ways.
Different perspectives. Yeah, there's a long theological reason for that, because they think that There's different, not different authors, but different sources of the Pentateuch. And so Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 maybe were different sources, and that's why they're so different in terms of their literary structure and all that. But that's a different story. What were you going to say, Tim?
Yeah, well, I would say let's don't just look at the Bible verses for a reason why some Christians want to become more powerful and assert powerful in an authoritative way through government.
Yeah.
Maybe the reason is not so much the word dominion. One important concept that's been talked about by many other people is that when the rate of change increases in a culture, it stimulates a rise in fundamentalism.
Yes.
Because it's creating fear that you're going to be marginalized, that the things that you hold as true are going to be overridden by the sheer volume of voices of people who are saying, no, that doesn't make any sense. So to me, and this here in the USA, if we look to January 6, 2021, it was like the acting out of dominion theology.
Yeah,
and
really was.
I'm sure a
Christian
lot of those
insurrection.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of those people, when you listen to them, it sounds familiar in terms of dominion theology. So one of the things, and not to diminish the question about where did they get the word if they're not using the King James Version, I think that's a good question, but I think we need to look at the sociological and psychological motivations and specifically fear of loss of control, because what's happening with a lot of conservative Christians in the US anyway is, okay, this whole thing of gender, wow, that's getting, and Genesis says God made them male and female. So, all this complexity and the psychology of gender, that's just too much for them. So they're focusing on who can go in a restroom. Arkansas just passed some laws that make it hard for transgender people.
Yeah.
So I think that's just something we need to keep in mind.
It's a good point. Yeah, it's a sociological aspect of how they their hermeneutics, isn't it? All right, so let's move on. Let's talk about Christian nationalism. This is a piece that has to go along, I think, with the dominion theology piece. This is a really interesting quote, again, from recent guest Frederick Clarkson. He says, once one has arrived at the notion that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, and that this means based on biblical or Christian principles, they're often used interchangeably, one holds a self-issued license to serve as spokesperson for God and the founding fathers. Political opinions take the character of revealed truths. And I think that is a really important point that Frederick Clarkson's making. Once you buy that notion, America was a Christian nation, then you're in a position to start issuing not just opinions, but it's a truth. Some of these people believe that the Constitution is just as inspired as the Bible, and all this. So they've got some very strong beliefs on what America's sort of past was. And I think Fred Clarkson nails it right here. And then moving on. So Christian nationalists, here's another name that you might have come across, David Barton. He runs an organization out of Aledo, Texas called Wall Builders. And he is probably the foremost Christian nationalist, quote, historian in America. He goes all over the country speaking at churches and seminaries and Bible colleges and gives tours of the Capitol and everything else. What he does, he combines quotes from the founding fathers in the Bible to construct what historian Frank Lambert calls a usable past. It's basically historical revisionism or a convenient myth. So if you ever look up David Barton on YouTube, he's got all kinds of videos. You'll see what I mean. He'll give a presentation and he'll just bombard the audience with quote after quote after quote after quote after quote from founding fathers and people who signed the Declaration of Independence to, quote, prove that they were not only staunch Christians, but that they founded America to be a Christian nation, period, and that we should become one again, right? And so going back to Fred Clarkson's point, once you've bought that, that's why David Barton is so popular among evangelicals in the Christian right, because he gives that justification from a sort of historical point of view. He overwhelms you with quotes. It's hard to keep your head straight when you're listening to David Barton speak, because he's been doing this for so long. And then, so going on with Fred Clarkson's quote from that same article, Christian citizens must elect Christian candidates of the right sort, of course, who are then able to craft policies based on Christian principles, because that is what God requires of his Christian nation. So you can see the Dominionist piece and the Christian nationalist piece coming together. If you believe in Christian nationalism, then what do you do about it? Well, you vote for the right candidates, Christians who should be in charge. Then they can then craft laws, policies, because that's what God wants. That's what will make America go back to becoming a, quote, Christian nation again. And that's, hopefully you're starting to see how that comes together. Why? So this explains, I think, why a great many just garden variety evangelical, they've never heard of even Dominion theology. They've never heard of Rushdoony. They've never heard of these people, but they buy this basic premise. It appeals to their patriotism. You know, America was a Christian nation. We need to become one again. That is such a common belief among almost all American evangelicals. It's just accepted as truth because of guys like David Barton and other people. They've spread that myth. You know, so we need to become a Christian nation again. How are we going to do that? Elect Christian candidates, and they can start passing laws that are going to turn America back into a Christian nation again. And that becomes the Dominionist piece. All right, look at this quote then. This is really interesting. This is a quote from a Dominion theologian. He said, Christians have an obligation, a mandate, a commission, a holy responsibility to reclaim. You see, there's that reclaim piece. Remember what I was saying, Adam and Eve lost their dominion. We have to get it back. We got to reclaim the land for Jesus Christ, to have dominion in civil structures, just as in every other aspect of life and godliness. But it is dominion we're after, not just a voice. Christian politics has as its primary intent the conquest of the land, of men, families, institutions, bureaucracies, courts, and governments for the kingdom of Christ. So George Grant, The Changing of the Guard, 1987, is when he wrote this book. And that's where they're at. This is what the leadership of the Dominion theologians are up to. This is what they're doing, right? It's dominion we're after. And you see that they have that idea. They view the book of Joshua, for example, as a template. They go into the land just as Joshua did in the book of Joshua, and they conquered the land. You know, you take over the various regions of, quote, the land, which is America, and you establish some sort of a kingdom of Christ. Yeah, kind of a concerning thing, isn't it? All right, so let's look at now, we've got these three key figures. We've got Abraham Vereide, then we'll look at Rushdoony, and then take a look at Seven Mountains. So here he is, Abraham Vereide. He was a Norwegian immigrant who came to the United States. So briefly, there's a lot on him. If you've seen the family, you already know this story. But basically, he lived in my hometown. He was from Norway, but he lived in Seattle, Washington. He claimed to have a vision from God in 1935 that the church had been getting it wrong for 2,000 years. Now, when I heard that, that made me think instantly of Joseph Smith. If you know Mormon history, Joseph Smith claimed to have the exact same revelation from God, didn't he? The church had been getting it wrong for 2,000 years. You've got to put it right. So Smith founded the Mormon church. Vereide founded the family. So what was wrong? What he says God told him was that rather than focusing on the down and outs, this is what Christianity had been getting wrong for 2,000 years. Christianity should instead aim to target the up and outs, what he called key men or top men who would be in a position to influence society for God. And now the thing about Vereide is I don't think he never used the word dominion. He didn't, it wasn't a thing when he was in 1935. But the reason I put Vereide in there is that he was the first person I can see historically who actually put the pieces together. He was doing dominion theology before it was called dominion theology. And you can see how he was doing it. He's thinking, wait a minute, we need to save the top men. businessmen, politicians, military leaders, wealthy influencers in society. What'll happen then is that if we get the top men saved and following Jesus, the blessing will trickle down to the populace. And ultimately, that's the best way to help the needy. That's the best way to help the poor. That's what the church had been getting wrong all these 2,000 years, right? And that is a dominionist vision, right? But then he started in my hometown. That's my connection to the family. What he did was he started a prayer group of wealthy businessmen, and their goal was to clean up the city. And a lot of it was about going against the labor unions. But what they did is they just got together and they prayed together. They built a network, and they started thinking, how can we get involved politically to start changing things? So one of the members of this original group in Seattle became the mayor of Seattle, then later the governor of Washington State. So they could point to that and say, yeah, the system is working. This is all about getting men elected to higher office, getting them in positions of leadership. And by doing that, we will change society. And that is a dominionist agenda. So basically how it grew, this is the ICL, the International Christian Leadership, that then became the fellowship, or better known as the family. They expanded nationwide. So they started in Washington State, started going to other states and setting up offices in various other states. In 1942, they officially incorporated, that became their headquarters. Eventually, they had an outpost in Washington, D.C., as well as in hundreds of countries worldwide. If you've seen the family, it will scare you to death, because we don't know who they're talking to. We don't know who they're meeting with. They have senators, congressmen, judges, generals, admirals, wealthy businessmen, and they travel all over the world. They've got outposts all over the world, meeting with dictators, despots, prime ministers, presidents, leaders, businessmen. Nobody knows what the family's up to, but they are intentionally underground. That's their aim. We want to be covert. We want to be on the down low. The only event they hold publicly is the National Prayer Breakfast every February in Washington, where usually the president will speak. Every president since Eisenhower has spoken at the prayer breakfast. So that's how powerful their thing is. But that's a tiny little fraction of what the family's up to. So that's Vereide. And listen to this quote. This is really interesting. From that same prayer breakfast in 1955, Vereide closed the meeting by praying to God. He said, "Hear, O God, we dedicate ourselves to Christ," speaking to all the people, the vice president, congressmen, senators, businessmen. He said, "We want as a nation and as representatives from many nations to become one great team, working in the rhythm of defined purpose and in the warmth of God's love and with the firmness and fitness of disciplined minds." So you can see how he's thinking. Not just an American thing, a worldwide thing. We're a great team, all working together. And he concludes by saying, "To this end, O God, take us now as leaders in the various fields of endeavor." So in other words, as I read this prayer of Abraham Vereide, it seems to me, okay, he didn't use the word dominion theology anywhere, but this is a dominionist agenda, isn't it? Let's get the top men and women saved. We'll form a great team all around the world working together. For what? No matter what field of endeavor you're from, he was interested in leaders. And that's the whole aim of the family. And I say, if you want more information on the family, read The Family or watch the series on Netflix or read C Street by Jeff Charlotte. He goes into a lot more detail. All right, second person now, we'll look at R.J. Rushdoony. There he is. He had a great beard, those of us that are fans of beards. So who was R.J. Rushdoony? Okay, so he was Armenian, all right? Now, that's not Armenian as in the theology, the difference, opposite of Calvinist. He was ethnically from Armenia, and that's important because the way he formed his worldview had a lot to do with what happened in Armenia in World War I during the Turkish massacre of the Armenians. But Rushdoony, he was born in 1916, died in 2001. He was the first to articulate the notion of dominion theology. He was quite a thinker and a theologian and a sort of a teacher. He developed a system which became known as Christian Reconstructionism. That is the movement that he founded. And he, as far as I can tell, I've talked to a lot of people and asked this question, before Rushdoony, there was no such thing as dominion theology as a system. He was the first to put all the pieces together. And his system was what he called Christian Reconstructionism. Now, there's a lot in our R.J. Rushdoony, but I don't want to go into too much detail. The thing about Rushdoony, you got to understand, is he was theologically, he was a post-millennialist. So those of us that have studied theology, we know what that means. It means that if you're a post-millennialist, you believe that God's kingdom has to be established by the church before Christ returns. And that's different than premillennial, which most evangelicals are premillennial, aren't they? They believe that Christ is going to return, there's going to be a rapture, he's going to defeat the armies of Satan, then there's going to be a 1,000-year kingdom, which is the millennial kingdom. Rushdoony had it the exact opposite. He said, wait a minute, the church is about establishing the kingdom and then Christ will return. So if we're going to do that, we have to come up with a system whereby we can actually do that. He was the first one to take it seriously. So he was also a Christian nationalist. So looking at America, he's answering the question, what would a godly society look like if we were to set up a kingdom and then Christ will return? The answer in his system was it will be governed by the Old Testament laws, what he called a theonomy. So in other words, Rushdoony's Christian Reconstructionism said, what we need to do is we need to set up a society that is governed by the laws of the Old Testament, specifically the Ten Commandments. And if you read his book, The Institutes of Biblical Law, that is over 1,000 pages, and it's a running commentary on the Ten Commandments. And basically his system was, let's go through each of the Ten Commandments and we will lay out what it would look like if America, modern society, was governed by the Ten Commandments. And that's where he comes up with things like the death penalty for gay people and incorrigible teens and women who lost their virginity before they're married, because that's what the Old Testament prescribes. And so he said, we take it literally. That's what the Bible says. That's what we'd have to do if we can establish a theonomy. But for Rushdoony, it was a long-term strategic vision. It was going to take generations. And this is where this Reconstructionist notion comes from, what he called reconstructed men. So what you have in Rushdoony's worldview, you have these families, godly families, in which children would be ideally homeschooled. That's why Rushdoony had such a massive influence on Christian education and homeschooling. So basically, throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, Rushdoony went all over the country. He wrote book after book after book. And he was a key witness in many, many trials of Christian parents who were trying to institute homeschooling. And he served as an expert witness, and he helped to get a lot of state laws passed whereby it became legal to homeschool your children as a Christian homeschooler. And that's why Rushdoony was so interested in pushing that agenda, because in his view, that's where you would produce generation after generation after generation of godly children. Eventually, there'll be enough of them where they'll take over society. We'll just rule the world, and that's why homeschooling is so important. And his system really provided the architecture of much of what would become the Christian right in America. So basically, he had already written all these books before the Christian right started in the late 70s and 80s. When they were looking for theological and biblical justification, how do we put this together? Rushdoony's already got it all done. He's just handing them his books and saying, look, I've already done this. I've already laid the groundwork, in terms of theology and a biblical theology. So they started reading Institutes of Biblical Law and other things. Now, they might have rejected some of the more extreme elements of his theology, but basically it's the architecture, it's the framework of the Christian right. And a lot of them, they believe it, they just don't, they're not emphasizing it right now. They're saying, we're just going to put it on the down low. All right, so that's Christian Reconstructionism. Listen to these quotes from Rushdoony. This will tell you where his theology is coming from. Right before he died in 2001, he said, if you believe in biblical law and are a Christian, then Christ is your king. You're going to be ruled by a body of laws very different from that governs the state, and more thorough because it will govern you from within. That's the reconstructed man type of idea. It's an internal thing rather than from without. And with this kind of government, you can truly create a different society. That, in a nutshell, is the essence of Christian Reconstructionism. It's a one person at a time, one family at a time, governed from within, and eventually, generationally, you'll have a completely different society, a theonomy, right? And that's the essence of Christian Reconstructionism. And then he said, too, in another book, Christian political action is necessary towards making the state again a Christian state and its actions conform with the law of God. So you see that we need to make America Christian again. There's the Christian nationalist piece. He's saying it used to be a Christian state. We got to get it back. How do we do that? You've got to get involved in political action. That's how it's going to be done. All right, I know we're moving through a lot of material, but we've got one more to look at. Now we're going to get into the Seven Mountains Mandate. So we got three key names in here. Bill Bright, Loren Cunningham. If you know who the first two are, Bill Bright was the founder of Campus Crusade for Christ, which is now Cru. Loren Cunningham founded YWAM, which is Youth with a Mission. C. Peter Wagner, I know Tim Morley will know these names as well, probably as Gary. C. Peter Wagner was huge. He helped found the Vineyard Movement along with John Wimber. He taught at Fuller Seminary in California, and he was a huge proponent of church growth theology. He wrote book after book after book, but he also got into dominion theology and this Seven Mountains Mandate and helped promote it a lot. So the way this went, so the story goes that Bill Bright and Loren Cunningham each claimed that they independently received a revelation from God somewhere about 1975, laying out what's called the Seven Mountains Mandate dominion theology. So they claimed that Francis Schaeffer also received the same revelation. Now, I've talked to Frank Schaeffer a couple times, and he swears this is not true at all. He said, my dad was no dominionist, so I don't know. But Loren Cunningham claimed that Francis Schaeffer said he was a Seven Mountains guy too, but I've never found it in any of Francis Schaeffer's writings. But anyway, now this is where they get their directive from Isaiah 2:2. Which says, in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Which is ironic because, of course, I've always interpreted that when I was a Christian as a messianic verse. In other words, it's a sort of a prophecy of the end times. When Yahweh's kingdom is established, all the nations will stream into it. But they view it as, no, we have to take those mountains, and when we do, that's when we'll transform the world. Yeah, interesting take. So this is from the Generals International website from Cindy Jacobs, who's another massive figure in the Seven Mountains community, and she talks about the mandate that Cunningham and Bright claim to have gotten from God to bring godly change to a nation by reaching its seven spheres or mountains of societal influence. They, that's Bright and Cunningham, concluded that in order to truly transform any nation with the gospel of Jesus Christ, these seven facets or mountains of society must be reached: religion, family, education, government, media, arts and entertainment, and business. And that's straight from the General's website, which is Cindy Jacobs' website, right? So that's the seven mountains of dominion theology. And it's all about transforming nations. We can, once Christians are sitting on top of these seven mountains, we'll transform the whole nation. And you notice, see, this is why it's a different iteration from Rushdoony. This is a completely different sort of methodology. They both believe in dominionism. They're both dominionists, but the means by which you arrive at taking charge of society is totally different, right? Rushdoony was a long-term generational thing. Family by family by family. For the Seven Mountains, it's all about, we'll see in a minute, spiritual warfare and taking these seven mountains. That's a completely different sort of objective, but they're both dominionists. So you got to be careful how you put these sort of streams together. So we see C. Peter Wagner. Whoops, let me go back one. Oops, we lost one. Uh-oh, hang on. So C. Peter Wagner, he helped spread the message of the Seven Mountains Mandate by teaching it nationwide, all over America. He wrote a lot of books on Dominionism. He was instrumental in founding the NAR Church Network, the New Apostolic Reformation. And he claims he didn't found it, but if it wasn't for Wagner, the NAR churches wouldn't exist. So we're talking about churches like Bethel Redding, IHOP Kansas City, the International House of Prayer, so many big names right now that we're seeing, and certainly in the Trump world. And I know Shannon's done a ton of reading and writing and research on this. Sean Foyt and people like him are part of the NAR network of churches, apostolic churches. So you can see, this is a rogues gallery. You probably are familiar with some of the names: Cindy Jacobs, Dr. Lance Wallnau, and I know Tim was mentioning at our old church in Chester, they brought Lance Wallnau in. He is a major player. He was taught by C. Peter Wagner and sort of took the mantle on the Seven Mountains thing. Paula White Cain, of course, was Trump's spiritual advisor. Mega Church in Florida. Kenneth Copeland, we all know. Dutch Sheets, Chuck Pierce, Shay On, Mike Bickle of IHOP Kansas City, Bill and Benny Johnson of Bethel Redding, Sean Foyt. I know Shannon's a big fan of Sean Foyt. We all know Rick Joyner, Morningstar Ministries. Todd White, he's another worship leader who's another charismatic. Guillermo Maldonado, you may not know his name, but Trump held an Evangelicals for Trump rally at his church in Miami in January of 2020. And he's a big NAR figure in the sort of Hispanic Latinx community down there in Miami, and a bunch of others. So if you see the word apostolic anywhere, NAR, an independent network of charismatic churches, they're probably going to be in this Seven Mountains camp. So those are key words that you have to sort of look for. Anyone that says apostolic, your hackles should go up. That should be a red flag. All right. So this is the sort of image here. And you notice that, again, that word reclaiming. You see, we had it, we lost it. Adam and Eve had that dominion. They lost it. Satan's now the god of this world. So in the Seven Mountains Dominion theology, it's all about spiritual warfare. So what they talk about, it's really strange. You know the story in, I think it's Matthew, was it Matthew 7? The parable of the sheep and goats. There's the last judgment. Everyone's standing in front of Jesus' throne. He divides them into sheep and goats. The sheep go to heaven, the goats go to hell. Well, the way they look at it, they say, actually, that applies to entire nations. You have sheep nations that are going to go to heaven. So America would be a sheep nation, I guess. We're a Christian nation. A goat nation is a nation that is predominantly not Christian. So like a Muslim nation, a Buddhist nation, a Hindu nation, that would be a goat nation. What we need to do is we need to transform the goat nation into a sheep nation. And the way we do that is we need to get on top of every one of those seven mountains, and that will transform the nation into a sheep nation. It's a strange way to look at it, but that's what they talk about. Anytime you hear them talking about goat nations, that's what they're talking about. So the way they believe is that on top of each one of those seven mountains, there's a demonic entity. Okay, what you have to do by going into spiritual mapping and spiritual warfare, you've got to go up there. You've got to fight those demons. Well, first of all, you got to identify who they are. So every city, every region has a sort of a demonic entity that's assigned to that region. So you might have a demon over Liverpool or a demon over New York, and you've got sub-demons and all the rest of it. You've got to name those demons, find out who they are, engage in spiritual warfare. Once you displace those demons, then you can take your rightful place of dominion atop that mountain, and then you can begin to transform the nation. So if you look at that picture, every one of those seven mountains, there's a demon sitting up there, basically. So it's our job as Christians to go up those mountains, fight our way up the mountains, kick the demons off the mountains, and take charge. And once we're sitting on top of all seven, we'll transform the nation. It'll become a sheep nation, and I guess they'll all go to heaven. That's their sort of, in a nutshell, that's what they're talking about. But I would consider it loaded language. It's a cult-like sort of system, you know. So you got to know these loaded language phrases like goat nation, sheep nations, spiritual mapping. That they have a lot of loaded language in there. They mean a lot of different things. So there's one other thing that's worth pointing out, this difference of soft versus hard dominionism. So you gotta look at this aspect of the two elements of dominion theology. This is another one from Chip Burlett. He says that soft dominionists are Christian nationalists. So you might have people who believe in dominion theology, but they're not hardcore about it. They believe that biblically defined immorality and sin breeds chaos and anarchy. They fear that America's greatness as God's chosen land has been undermined by secular humanists, feminists, and homosexuals. Their vision has elements of theocracy, but they stop short of calling for supplanting the Constitution and Bill of Rights. I think a lot of American evangelicals would fall into the soft dominionist crowd. They're not in the Rushdoony camp. They're not talking about stoning gays. They're not talking about wiping away the Constitution. However, they believe in Christian nationalism, and they believe that they need to do something about it. They don't want to institute a theocracy per se, but they want Christians to be in charge nonetheless. And that's kind of a soft dominionist. Whereas the hard, they believe all that, but they want United States to be a Christian theocracy. They believe that Christian men with specific theological beliefs are ordained by God to run society. This would include Christian Reconstructionists, but we're seeing a growing number in the Christian right who are believing this more of a hard side of dominionism. So we got to be careful when you use the word dominion theology. You've got to know who you're talking about. Are you talking about the hard? It's a spectrum, I think. You're talking about a spectrum. Some real hardcore ones on the far right, some maybe on the left. Where are they? You've got to talk to them and find out sort of where they're coming from. All right. So in other words, then, not every evangelical who is involved in politics is necessarily a dominionist, although they may well have been influenced by elements of it. So it's become common parlance in the United States for sure. Christians just use these terminologies. They don't even know. They'll talk about, we need to take the 7 mountains. Do you know what that means? No, but I've heard it from somebody. They've been influenced by it. They've never heard of Rushdoony, but they use words that he used, and they're influenced by him, even though they've never heard of it. All right. So we see this, for example, the Capitol riots. Here, I mean, look at this. This says it all right here, doesn't it? It was a Christian insurrection. Guy with a Bible shows up with Trump signs. They're storming the Capitol, and you see this kind of stuff. I mean, is this old nice couple, are they dominionists? Probably not. They've never heard of Rushdoony. They've never heard of Lance Wallnau. But yet there's the Christian nationalist piece, combining Christianity with politics. They've been influenced by it, but yet I bet you they've never heard. If you said, have you heard of R.J. Rushdoony? Do you know what dominion theology is? They would have never heard of that. But yet there they are. Nonetheless, they are taking action in a dominionist sense to do something about their belief system. And Trump was going to be the vehicle that got them there to, achieve dominion, I guess. And it all fell apart. So last thing, and then we can throw it open for questions. How is dominionism spreading worldwide? I think this is maybe where some of the people from the UK and other places might start to be concerned. So the family, going back to the family, it's like concentric circles. So they have this property in Washington, D.C. It's pretty strange when you think about it. Up to 8 congressmen or senators live at this property, which is basically rent-free. They're mentored in the leadership principles of Jesus by family leaders. Imagine that. Democrats and Republicans all living together in the same house, being indoctrinated, I would say, in this dominionist. How can we enact Jesus's leadership principles in our policies as congressmen, senators at C Street? Okay, then this is where they take this mandate. They say, look, it's Paul. At the Damascus Road, God said to Ananias that this man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings. So Paul's mandate, he was to go to the kings. That's the top men. You don't waste your time. Of course, they ignore the Gentiles and the people of Israel, but you got to win the kings, man. That's what it's all about. And that's why Paul was so important. And so what they do, they've got this small group of, congressmen, senators that are indoctrinated in this dominionist theology. They have this national prayer breakfast every February. They just bring leaders from all over the world just to form relationships. So it's all about, hey, you're just part of the family. Congressmen, senators, military officers, wealthy businessmen. What they do then is they go back to their country, and then they send these representatives to their country. So being a senator, being a congressman is going to open a lot of doors in Africa or the Middle East or wherever, Asia. And you're going to get an audience with the president, prime minister, king, despot, dictator, whoever, as opposed to just people like you and me. We're just average citizens. When they get in there, they start saying, okay, if you accept Jesus, we'll release financial aid, U.S. foreign aid to your country. We'll help you buy weapons. We'll help you suppress your enemies. You know, we'll turn the taps on and money will start to flow if you accept Jesus, right? And that's all about this kind of how this works. And that's basically what the family is doing. Nobody knows what they're doing, right? So we've seen, for example, in places like Uganda and Romania, where especially we see it in the anti-gay legislation that's been passed in places like Uganda, the family was all over that. They were the ones who were pushing that agenda. And basically they view other countries as sort of like laboratories where they can try things out there because they can't get away with it in the United States. So they do it in Uganda, they do it in Romania, and they see what happens. And in Uganda, the anti-homosexuality bill ended up getting struck down after being enforced because it was a human rights violation. But they still tried it. They still ran it out there just as a model legislation to see if it might work in places like the UK or the United States. Let's see what happens. You know, so it's like a laboratory. So it's very concerning. And then what we're seeing is a growing number of NAR affiliated churches worldwide that preach the Seven Mountains Dominion theology. So for example, I was looking on the El Rey Jesus, which is the Guillermo Maldonado church in Miami that Trump had his Evangelicals for Trump rally at. On their website, there's a link to international churches that are affiliated with them. I started finding churches in the UK, in South Africa, that are NAR churches preaching Seven Mountains Mandate stuff in places like, you know, South Africa and in the UK and in Europe. So that started getting me to think, wait a minute, what's going on here? We're seeing a lot of stuff that's spreading worldwide just off the back of the NAR churches. So that's my presentation. I'll stop the sharing. You want to open it up for questions? Maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion. I know we've gone on for about an hour, but should we throw it open and maybe see what we get?
That was awesome research. Bravo for you.
Thank you, Terry.
Really great.
That's a lot of work.
Right. Can I just say, I first of all to thank you, Clint. That was excellent background.
Yeah, thank you.
Into, you know, and some of it I knew, some of it I didn't. So I really appreciate all the work that's gone into that and your research. I think the reason I called you was not to check up on why you weren't going to church anymore.
Thank you.
Most of the people I know on the UK side, well, not all of them, but some of us have been in the same boat as you anyway. So yeah. I think it's not so much a question, but my desire really was from this is to get like-minded people to come and talk together.
Yeah.
And for me personally, I mean, I think it seems to me anyway that the church in Europe, and certainly in the UK, seems to be a very different, the evangelical church seems to be a very different animal from what we see and observe in the States. But there's a sort of a common saying, isn't there, that when America sneezes, Europe catches a cold.
Yeah.
And I think I personally know people who hold very strongly to a dominionist theology, some without knowing it, and probably some without knowing all the terminology and the history, and others who might. And it just seemed to me to be a creeping thing that's becoming more vocal. I think anyway, it's still low key. But like you said at the beginning, I had a concern that this was something that we might see more and more of in the UK and in Europe. So for me personally, this was about getting together like-minded people. It's really good that you've given us an introduction to and a great overview of it. But for certainly us Europeans anyway, to go, what can we learn from this? How can we address this? And is there anything we can do about this? And how serious is it? I think, as I said, it's a different animal, I think, in the European church to the American church. But I'm certainly starting to see some of this coming through. It seems like, and Deanne, who's here as well, is from Bulgaria, and I think he's seeing more of this in parts of Eastern Europe. So he could probably have, he could probably say more on that. So I'd like to, I know we got some guys from the other side of the pond to us, but it would be good to hear how we think this may be impacting us over this side.
Well, yeah, as I said, that's a good point, Tim. I think my objective in putting this together was to give you the key words and the terminology so that then you can go, okay, I've been looking at this, but I didn't know what to call it. I didn't know what to put the names to the faces, as it were. Now that you have that background, hopefully you can say, like you said, Lance Wallnau spoke at our old church in Chester. I mean, Rick Joyner, we know people that went to Morningstar, whatever the academy is. That guy's a major Seven Mountains Dominionist guy. So they're over here going all over Europe speaking, Rob and Alice are good friends of, used to be good friends. To what extent are they promoting it all around the continent?
So Clint, I was trying to apply some of this dominion theology, and it was interesting to learn that Adam and Eve had dominion over all the seven mountains, including media and entertainment, I would assume.
Yeah.
And they were the only two people, and they didn't have any clothes. So my question is, do dominionists support nude entertainment based on Genesis?
Yeah, I want to become a nude dominionist. I'm not sure they would say that the Seven Mountains concept was fully developed in the garden. I think it became a thing where that's how human society sort of developed, and it sort of evolved into these seven major areas. But certainly they would agree that they had dominion, that they lost it, and we've got to regain it. In their view, it's the Seven Mountains. I
think, to me, one of my seminary professors said one thing out of a whole year of classes that I remembered, and specifically, and he said, if you're ever tried to challenge something, the most powerful way to challenge it is to show internal inconsistencies.
Right.
And the silly little thing I just said, it was probably a poor attempt at doing it. But to me, if I get back in my, ministerial mindset.
Yeah, put your pastor's hat on.
It is riddled with inconsistencies.
Yeah.
And some of the participants were chatting during the presentation about it's a reversion to the Old Testament. It ignores large elements of the gospel.
Yeah.
Here in Houston, Texas, Ed Young is the pastor of Second Baptist Church, which is one of the largest churches in the Southern Baptist Convention, second only to Joel Osteen's church here in Houston.
Wow, that's saying something.
I was a pastor back in the 80s and early 90s in the suburbs of Houston, and personally experienced, and this is in my book, Goodbye Jesus, Ed Young's church was reaching out, and it was hurting other churches in the denomination. But one of the things that all of us pastors figured out really quickly is that they were looking for the most affluent people. That's who they targeted. And today, and actually there was one church where the pastor left and they literally took over the church. They merged with the church. They tried to do that with the church that I left. And Ted Cruz, one of our two Texas senators, went to high school at Second Baptist Church's high school. So here you see a real life, Ed Young is socially acceptable, respected. Ted Cruz comes out of there. Wouldn't surprise me if he has views along these lines.
Oh, he does. Well, his dad's a major, Raphael Cruz is a definite Seven Mountains guy.
So, but then the other thing that comes out with somebody like Ted Cruz, and Donald Trump is an even more powerful example, is that these, and then the guy who started who's reported to be a Dominionist, the judge Paul Pressler, who has accusations about homosexual behavior coming at him that are somewhat seem to be credible. And then you have Ted Cruz recently leaving the state during one of the worst crises we've experienced when the freeze hit.
Yeah.
So frequently these people, when you get up close enough to them, they aren't even living out the basics of the teachings of Jesus in some core areas. And to me, that's a radical inconsistency. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Can I come in, Clint?
Yeah.
Can I come in? Yeah. Thanks again for this. I didn't know much about, Dominion theology, although I had seen about half of the family shows that were on, the series that was on Netflix, and I found it very, very fascinating. But as you've kind of elucidated it for us, and sort of given us the sort of Domination Theory 101 lecture, which I really enjoyed, there's one word or name that just doesn't seem to crop up, and Tim's the only one who's mentioned it so far, and that's Jesus. And I just don't see where Jesus fits into this seven mountain hermeneutic or any of the stuff that you've been telling us about. Yeah. And if the first Adam lost it, how comes the second Adam didn't get it back?
Yeah. Well,
why didn't the incarnation of God come and reclaim and set up this dominating kingdom?
Well, wouldn't maybe the answer to that be that the second Adam got it back, but it's only in heaven and not on earth?
Well,
so I don't believe that Jesus ever had that idea.
Yeah, but well, I think what they would say, Gary, is that the part of the theology is Adam and Eve lost the dominion in the garden. Jesus essentially got it back for us, but it's up to us then to actually enact it, So they would see, because what they look at, for example, the Sermon on the Mount, the prayer of Jesus, when he says, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now they take that verse, they say what Jesus was saying was that earth should become a mirror of what's already happening in heaven. Okay. Right? So God's already got a kingdom and he's the ruler of it in heaven. So eventually that kingdom is going to be reflected down here on earth. So it's up to us to actually, make that happen.
Okay. So therefore in Dominion theology, what's the purpose of Jesus?
Well, I think that's what they would say, is that he did reverse the curse, as it were, and grant the church the license, as it were.
The curse has been nullified.
Yeah, I think so.
So therefore, the victory is already won then.
The dominion part of it, yeah. But it's up to us then. It's sort of like a realized eschatology thing, isn't it? It's already, but not yet. We have to put it together. It's there.
I get it. But
and then
make it happen.
The NAR folks would have a totally different take too.
Yeah.
Where, Jesus is like the bringer of power.
Yeah.
And they also really hold on to the scripture, like, and you shall do better, even greater things.
Right.
And they interpret that from like, you will do greater things than even Christ. So that's why they can believe in things like resurrecting a 2-year-old who's been dead for 5 days, because they kind of see Jesus as like the nexus of power that you can kind of tap into, which I'm sure is really different than like Rushdoony.
Yeah.
He kind
wasn't
of
into spiritual warfare
his
thing.
theology.
Why? So why has it taken 2,000 years since Jesus, and this thing still hasn't come to any form of realization?
Well, I think they've been putting the pieces together. If you read Rushdoony, for example, I mean, he'll cite Calvin, he'll cite Kuyper from the 19th century. He's putting the pieces together in an actual system. He was the first one to put it all together, I guess you could say, but he didn't come up with it completely on his own. I mean, Calvin tried it in Geneva in a way, He tried to institute a kind of a theocracy in Geneva. You know, if you want to see what a theocracy looks like, you know, look at Geneva, look at Cromwell's England, you look at some of these time periods where you have people putting a sort of a theocracy system in place. They tried. Kuyper tried it in the Netherlands in the 19th century. He tried passing laws to kind of Christianize the country. That didn't work. So Rushdoony could point to examples like that and say, you know, it's not for lack of trying, but they didn't have all the pieces together. I've finally got it figured out now in a complete comprehensive system. We just need to now make it sort of happen.
It just sounds like.
Mike, I'll say something. Sorry.
Yeah.
Talking about Tim mentioned that how the evangelical church in the United States is quite different than the evangelical church in Europe, and one of the reasons is rooted in the history that we all share in Europe. That whole experiment in Dominionism or Christian nationalism has already been performed in Europe, which is why we still reap the consequences of that, and that's why such a severe secularism and atheism, because society has had it up to here from that Dominionism, to use the terminology we use today. But Christendom was exactly the implementation of that kind of views. To me, what happens in America today is basically a bit of a nostalgia, which because America didn't go through its own Christendom, they think they can do it better than we did. Maybe they will fail better than Europe did, but to the same end. And what happens is that the rise of the new bishops, I call them the rise of the new bishops, those new apostolic figures who try to get to prominence by declaring themselves apostles, prophets, which kind of came to in its climax when Trump and the 6th of January happened, and beyond that, they keep telling people, oh, God will do it, God will do it. But the problem, in my opinion, is, okay, we all know now about Dominionism. We've known it for years. We have speculated of how far it can go, and nationalism, what harm it can do. In my opinion, we need to talk about where we go from here on, because if you listen to them, to those the charismatic Dominionists, because for me they are the really dangerous and more popular and populist. The charismatic Dominionists, if you listen to them, it sounds really nice. It sounds really alluring. It sounds really tempting. And it sounds kind of, it almost sounds biblical, because of course they put it together in a very crafty way. But if you preach that to some ordinary person in church, they will say, so what? Yeah, it sounds great. We want the kingdom of God to be established. And that's why we want to influence society so more people get saved. And to do that, we need those good people in power. Of course, that didn't work. It doesn't work, like somebody pointed out. 2,000 years seems like we're not enough. Now we're going to reinvent the wheel because the clever American evangelicals will show us the way of how to create that Christendom that was never sustained long enough. But when we talk about that, we need to remember those intimate political nuances when it comes to Christian nationalism, because to the Western church, Christian nationalism may mean one thing, but I can tell you for the eastern part of the world, or at least Eastern Europe, Christian nationalism is actually can be quite different. In the West, in America especially, Christian nationalism is established by religious people. In the eastern part of Europe, Christian nationalism is weaponized by political figures who can see how that can work to establish their agenda. So it's not from the grassroots up, like religious people, believers who want to put key people in power. It's the other way around. Political figures can see the benefit of weaponizing those ideas and that ideology in order to progress their populism and to mobilize the whole population behind their movement or their party. And the other aspect of that as well is, which kind of links to liberational theology, is like, especially in my country, Bulgaria, Christian nationalism was what saved us as a nation. During the Ottoman Empire, 500 years of Ottoman Empire Caliphate in Bulgaria. If it wasn't for Christian nationalism, and that means completely different than what we say Christian nationalism is today, but if it wasn't for that, there wouldn't have been Bulgarian nation, Serbian nation, probably Greek nation, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about all that, we need to remember that it's not a new thing. We need to remember the history, the roots, and what comes out of the different variations, sociologically, politically, and geographically even, and try to find a way, when we discuss it, try to find a way, okay, what's the way forward? We saw Trump kind of give rise to that, bring it to its fruition, and we need to figure out how we can decontaminate the church from all those ideas, ideologies, propaganda. Honestly, when I watched American populists, evangelical populists, I call them evangelical populists, when I watch their propaganda, it is just a textbook communist propaganda machine. I've lived through it. I know how the communist propaganda machine works. They're very good. I mean, nobody's better than them, honestly. So American evangelicals, I'm sorry, you cannot reach that craftsmanship that the communists had, but it works the same way. And we need to make sure that we point the church, we point the regular people in church to, not to an alternative, actually, we need to point them back to the roots of Christianity, to demystify all that, all those new ideas, and just point out what they lead to. But if I was one of those people in church and I'm here today, I would actually ask, okay, what do we do about it? It's not just about telling people what Christian nationalism is, not just about framing and reframing what Dominionism is. People like it simple, and we need to tell them, once they're informed about it, okay, what's the outworking then of the church being present in society, the church bringing the kingdom of God with all of its principles and attributes on earth as it is in heaven, influencing politics, social life, cultural life, but not through imposition, like the Christendom did, and not in a way that we put off society to such an extent that they don't want to hear anymore about, truth of the gospel. So what is the way, the non-aggressive, still subversive, still revolutionary kind of message of the cross of Jesus for a new kingdom, new world, but in a way that, as I said, doesn't alienate people from the truth of the gospel.
Well,
sorry, I'm a bit long.
There's a lot of layers in that. Some of us may not believe everything you just articulated, but I would have resonated with you when I was a pastor. I'm sure some of us here would have, if that's your burden, you've got to figure that out yourself for sure. But I see people are dropping off. I was just thinking, I know we should probably sign off, but do you guys want to do this again? Because I've seen a lot of things in the chat, so that you might, if people want to do a follow-up call, we could do another meeting again. Maybe I can chat with Tim Morley and we can figure out, we could do another thing. I don't need to do a presentation, but if you want to do another call, let me know. You can send me a message, or I can chat with Tim Morley. Does that sound good, Tim? Do you want to maybe meet up and chat about if we want to do something like this again? And where do we go from here?
I personally think that would be a good idea, and I think it would be good to perhaps take Deanne's comment about what do we do about this? How do we take this?
Yeah.
What's the next steps? Yeah, I would definitely be up for it. And,
Okay.
you know, to hear from everybody, you know, because there's obviously, we're running out of time, but there's quite a few people that haven't actually spoken. So it would be good to hear from them as well.
Yeah, be really good. All right. So you want to sign off then, and then we'll figure out, maybe Tim and I can meet up and talk about, I can email, or Tim can email people, and we can try to set up another. If you don't have I'll put it in the chat. My keyboard is terrible. Oh, I just hit the caps lock. So that's, if you don't have my email, you can always email me, and then maybe we could set up a group of people. We can email it. If you want to opt out, just let me know. But yeah, I think that'd be good to do another chat, and then we can talk about maybe where could we go from here, how to educate people. Does that sound good?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. Then I'm going to sign off, go get something to eat. Have a great day, whatever's left of it. Thanks for dropping in. Thanks for all the participation. I've really enjoyed it. I was looking forward all day to this call. So thanks everyone. Thanks Tim for helping set this up.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
See you guys.
Take care, and we'll see you again. Thank you all for dropping in.
Thank you, Clint. I learned a lot. It's good.
Thanks, no problem. See you soon. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.